Beloved Community Talks. Welcome to the Beloved Community Talks. Together we win facing poverty, racism, and militarism. A special 50th commemorative symposium. In this segment entitled, Together We Win Facing Poverty, join Andy Odel, Jada McKenna, Terrence Lester, and Liz Theo Harris in this beloved community conversation about bridging societal divides and resilience in the face of ongoing poverty. Our moderator for this discussion is Dr. Vanetta West, Director of Education Programs at Points of Light.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for joining us this morning for this panel. It's a very important topic. As you may know, anytime we have a day of commemorating Dr. King or Mrs. King, as we did this week, everybody wants to be a part. And often there is a lack of synergy between comments and who Dr. King actually was and what he actually taught. So what we hope to do with these panels at this symposium is connect the dots. Is that okay? Yes. Because you've seen people quote King out of context and just wrong, frankly, to support something that based on our study and what we understand about him, he would not express. So this morning, on the topic of poverty, which he said is one of the triple evils that prevent us from building a beloved community, and which we believe, as Mrs. King did, Coretta Scott King, and Dr. King believed, that nonviolence is the path to the beloved community. What we hope to do this morning is simply demonstrate and discuss how poverty is a form of violence. So, Mrs. King has a quote where she mentions this: starving a child is violence. Neglecting a child's education is violence. So we want to expand our notion of what violence is, first, that it's not just physical. So when we discuss poverty this morning, one of the things we'll highlight is poverty is violence. So what is our nonviolent response to poverty? How do we eradicate it? And how do we help move humanity forward? That's what we're talking about this morning. I'm excited about it. Are you excited about it? Yeah, this is a courageous conversation now. So if we talk like we're in the living room at home, it's okay. Because what we hope to do at the King Center with Beloved Community Talks is help the global community start to have some very difficult conversations, because we must. So to that end, at belovedcommunitytalks.org, there are toolkits. There's a toolkit that assists in having those types of conversations. So we invite you to visit that site and to download that toolkit so that in our communities across this nation and the world, these conversations don't stop, but we continue to have them. We're honored to have with us today 4 panelists who will help us, join us, and be a part of a courageous conversation around poverty as one of the Kingian triple evils. Our first panelist is Jada McKenna. Jada is the Chief Operating Officer of Habitat for Humanity International, and she is responsible for the growth and development of Habitat for Humanity International, 1,300 local habitat organizations, and global impact across 70 countries. You look refreshed. 70 countries.
This has been great.
Prior to joining Habitat, McKenna was overseeing the U.S. government's Global Hunger and Food Security Initiative, Feed the Future, and held management positions at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, McKinsey & Company, American Express, and GE Consumer Finance. Jada earned a bachelor's degree in government from Harvard College and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Habitat remains a leader in helping drive affordable housing policies, grassroots involvement, and education in the ongoing struggle for housing access and to achieve legislation that supports fair and affordable housing. Please welcome Jada McKenna. Our next panelist is Andy Odel. He is a reconciler We need reconcilers, don't we? Author and speaker. He has a BA from Anderson University, an MDiv from Anderson School of Theology, and a PhD from King's College, University of Aberdeen. Andy is the executive director of Remerge, a community building nonprofit headquartered in Atlanta that focuses on reconciliation and peacemaking by giving attention to the ways in which people, institutions, systems, and places intersect to build beloved communities. Remerge hosts the Community of Reconcilers Network and directs the Community Building and Design Studio in historic Street Auburn, assisting others to create faithful and effective ways to lead change. And he's also an author. He's the editor of Joining Lives, a primer in the Ministry of Reconciliation. I think I just moved you to author. You're editor.
Well, I wrote it as well.
You wrote, okay. All right, good, good, good. He is married to Amy, and they have 3 daughters and 1 son. Please welcome Andy Odel. Our next panelist is Liz Theo Harris. She is the director of the Cairo Center and the national co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. She has spent the last 2 decades with grassroots, community-led, anti-poverty organizations working to build the movement to end poverty. In her book, Always With Us, she argues that being poor is not inevitable and that a theology that suggests otherwise has stifled the growth of a transformative movement to end poverty. She has led hundreds of trainings, Bible studies, and leadership development workshops, spoken at dozens of conferences and keynote presentations across the U.S. and globally, and published several articles and book chapters sharing her vision that poverty can be ended and that the poor can be agents of social change. Liz is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church. Please welcome Liz Theo Harris. I neglected to say Liz has a PhD from Union in New Testament and Christian origins. I wanted to mention that because those PhDs are hard to come by. I know. It'd be horrible if I didn't mention that, wouldn't it? Said, I'm sitting here on this panel and I'm all doctored up and she didn't even say anything. Our next panelist is Terrence Lester. Terrence Lester is a community activist, minister, speaker, author, and founder of Love Beyond Walls. He is a believer that everyone deserves equity, love, and a chance to change their lives. Terrence travels domestically and internationally, speaking about issues relating to social justice, poverty, homelessness, faith, and culture. His awareness campaigns on behalf of the poor have been featured in USA Today, NBC, AJC, Black Enterprise, Rolling Out, Upworthy, and have also been viewed by over 10 million people globally. His greatest passion involves educating the general public about pressing issues that plague the lives of those who are vulnerable and voiceless, and using the educational piece to mobilize an army of people to love and serve those who are unseen. Terrence holds 4 degrees and has written several books. He is happily married to his friend Cecilia, and together they have 2 wonderful children, Zion Joy and Terrence II. Please welcome Terrence Lester. Wonderful. We're going to start the conversation, okay? Just take a few minutes and share your story as we begin the conversation.
Thank you, Vanetta. It's really an honor to be here today, and I love the cozy nature of this, so thank you. I have the privilege of talking a little bit about Habitat this morning and our part and what we're doing to create the beloved community. One of our biggest challenges at Habitat is that people believe things about us that aren't true. So they believe that we give away homes. That's not true. We create homeowners. Our families are homeowners. The good one is they believe that President Carter founded us. That's not true, but he's our most famous volunteer, and we adore him. And the third one is that they believe that our roots, that we're just founded in a very benign nice charitable way. And the reality is that the roots of Habitat were actually very radical and very in line with what we're doing. Habitat originated at a place in southwest Georgia, Koinonia Farms, which was started as an interracial community in 1940 in southwest Georgia. And the founder of that, Clarence Jordan, had a famous saying that the poor need capital, not charity. Our founder spent time at Koinonia and was really moved by it. And one of the things that was at the root of poverty in the South and in the country, and that remains so today, is housing and people's lack of housing and lack of ownership of that housing. And so Habitat for Humanity came out of this interracial community in the 40s, was born in 1976, and was about bringing people together to create housing and home ownership and that asset that passes from generation to generation to poor people. Part of our model involves sweat equity, people participating in that. But those sweat equity hours, you can use those hours by going to community meetings, by volunteering, by engaging in your community, all kinds of things other than just construction, because that's what we're about, trying to build that community and working with people together. In the past 10 years, we've really moved beyond individual homes. We don't want to become the lottery for humanity, for just a few family getting houses. We really want to create affordable housing at scale for as many people as possible. So there are a couple of things that we've added to our repertoire, happily so. The first, which is at the root of what we're doing, is really our neighborhood and community development work. So in this, increasingly, instead of just going in and building a house, which in some cases we were building houses in communities that people didn't even want to live in, much less buy in. So someone would have a nice house, but still felt trapped in that home. So we increasingly are working with whole communities. We're coming in as part of coalitions, not on our own, not even leading those coalitions, and trying to give people, talking to residents about what they need, what will make this a better community in addition to housing. And sometimes we get unlikely answers. There was one community in Florida that we were working with, a Black community that had been poor, had long been neglected, and they did not have mailboxes. Something very simple that most people in homes take for granted. These people did not have mailboxes, so mail was not delivered to their homes. Can you imagine, how you pay bills with that, how you keep on track, how people find you? And so they said, we just really want mailboxes. So the first thing we did was got these people mailboxes. And it just changed their quality of life. Like, there's a trip you don't have to make every day. There's, things are on time, you're informed. And then from there, we went and helped to spruce up the community center and then helped to repair homes and do our other work. We are increasingly, like many people, chagrined at the rollbacks and the enforcement of fair housing and the increase of NIMBYism, the not in my backyard. That has spurred us to take an increasing role in advocacy and really speaking out for better housing policies, but also to help people to understand that these are your neighbors and that these are people and these are great families that you want to be near. The building homes with volunteers is actually not a very good construction strategy, but it is a strategy to bring people together who would never talk to each other otherwise and who would never be in community, and that's part of the reason that we cling to that so much. The other hope that we have, and what we're increasingly trying to do, is to shift those people into advocates for affordable housing, and into people that will work in their communities and say, yes, this should be happening in our backyard, and increasingly doing that. So those are just a few things, but we really want to be in partnership with others, want to work with people, and we have a really simple belief that everyone deserves a decent place to live, a decent place to call home. We all know that home determines everything. Home determines where you're educated, your health outcomes, and it's something that some people take for granted, and our role is to make sure that people know that that this shouldn't be taken for granted, and that our neighbors deserve decent housing.
Thank you.
I moved to Atlanta 10 years ago to experiment with reconciliation. I wasn't looking to develop programs, to create structured connections, but rather just to live into it. How could I learn about reconciliation? By just doing it, by just throwing myself into the deep end. So I moved into a diverse community, and I mean diverse on all levels, racially, economically. I thought, what would it look like if I just committed myself to joining lives with my neighbors in such a way where they didn't become like me, or that I didn't become like them, but rather in that joining together, God created something new out of us. I thought that's what reconciliation might look like. And it feels to me something like friendship looks. Not like Facebook friendship, but like friendship when we say, you know who your real friends are. We have a sense about what that is. This, not necessarily buddies, not even necessarily someone that I talk to every day. Maybe it's just someone that I know when I suffer, they'll suffer with me. That when I mourn, they mourn, and when I celebrate, they'll celebrate with me and not be jealous or upset with my success, but will enjoy that as I enjoy it. So I moved into this neighborhood, and I moved in not trying to fix anything or to hand things out. And in my neighborhood, there were both executives, solid middle class folks, and a huge homeless shelter. And I just began to walk the neighborhood and to listen to my neighbors and to hear their stories and to learn to become friends with them. More for my sake probably than for theirs, to tell you the truth. But the thing is, I was standing on the corner one day and talking with one of the guys I'd met on the street. And there was a person that walked up, and they were standing to the side. You know when you're talking with someone, but someone else wants to talk to you, and they just sort of stand there, and they kind of stare at you, and you notice them, but you're not really sure what to do. They're just waiting on you. Well, that's what happened. There was this young lady. She looked like she was about 16 years old, just standing there, clearly waiting to talk to me. So my friend, who I was just chatting with, he noticed as well, and he said, well, she clearly needs to talk to you. I'll just walk away. Okay, so I looked over, and she said, are you Pastor Andy? And a lot of people in the neighborhood call me Pastor Andy. Are you Pastor Andy? That's a dangerous question. Yes, I'm Pastor Andy. She said, I hear that you care about us.
Wow.
I said, I do care about you. And she threw herself at me, threw her arms around my neck, and began to weep. This beautiful, what looked like 16-year-old girl. She just began to weep, and I started to whisper into her ear. I was like, what's going on? What? And I just held her. She just clearly needed to be held, and I held her, and she started to tell me that she was being prostituted. She was put out in our neighborhood. And I said, I can get you out of this. You say the word, and I'll get you out of this. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was just a dude that lived in the neighborhood. But I said, you say the word and I'll get you out of this. She said, I can't. I said, what do you mean you can't? She goes, my mom's in jail right now, and I can't leave her. I said, you tell us her name, we'll get word to her, and we'll get you out of here. She said, no, you don't understand. My mom's the one who puts me out.
Wow.
She was her pimp. And what I came to learn subsequent after that was that her mom was put out as a kid as well, by her mom. And what was shocking to me, beyond just the reality of it, was that in my neighborhood, churches came from near and far to hand out food to homeless people, to give them a sandwich and get them to say Jesus, and then they separated ways and went back to their house in the suburbs. And this girl, whose name is Angel, was in the middle of all of that. And I just began to wonder, how? How do people not know? How do people not know that this little girl is being pimped on the street and abused numbing herself with crack addiction. How do they not know, or do they not care? And what about this girl's mom? How do they not know about her and her mom? What is the disconnect here? And the disconnect is clear, right? Our lives aren't joined together. We show up and hand out stuff and head on back, but we don't suffer together. We don't enter into each other's stories, so this can continue on unabated. I mean, you can have a sandwich, but your life isn't changed. It's not transformed, and mine isn't transformed either. Matter of fact, we've come to learn that traditional homeless ministry maintains the status quo. I can continue to be this, and you can continue to be that, because nothing has to change. Matter of fact, I'm dependent on you being here next week to bring my sandwich to. So we started to ask, what does reconciliation look like here? Not in a generic way, not in some theological, otherworldly way, but what does it look like here, where I am? What would it look like for me to join lives with someone and allow those relationships to begin to shape other relationships, begin to shape the way that I see the world and the way that I see neighbors, and how might that have an effect in my other spheres of influence? Matter of fact, we've come to believe, and this is some of the academic work that comes out of this academic work as well as this experienced life, is that institutions, systems, cultures are nothing more than relationships, just manifest on different levels. So the institution that I form is based on the way that I see certain neighbors. I see you a certain way, so I'm going to do a certain thing to you, and I see employees as a certain way, and I'm going to see, so if I see them as employees and not people, then I treat them in a certain way. But if I see you as a neighbor, I treat you in another way. So for me, and now for this organization that was really born out of a conversation with a prostitute on the corner of my neighborhood, reconciliation and poverty is a relational question. So I think about Remerge, the organization that I lead, was born out of, in the midst of the recession. And the stories of the recession and bankers and all of that went on, and whatever the detail of that is, one thing that we knew was that these people were being rewarded for a destructive work. And people would tell me all the time, well, that's the system. You have to, these are the people who know how it works, so you've got to pay them to keep them around, and that's the system that we work in, and that's fine. That's fine, that's the system that we work in. But the thing is that Jesus doesn't ask you about the system, it asks you about how you love neighbors. And there's no, you can say that's the system, so it has to work that way, but you can't say that they love neighbors. You can't. So for Christians, and I'll just speak as a Christian, the system can't be the answer. Loving neighbors has to be the answer. And loving neighbors will then shape the institutions that I'm a part of. If I truly love my neighbors, then I'm not getting a gazillion-dollar bonus while I have to lay off 1,000 people. I can't say that I love neighbors. And will that cause me to suffer? Of course it will. Will it maybe I lose my job? Of course it might mean that. And if I love my neighbor, then that's okay, I can suffer that. But if it's just an employee, then I don't have to think about it, and I can push it away. So what Remerge wants to do is to create in communities and in institutions and in leaders this thing that we call the reconciler's imagination. How do you begin to see the world through this lens of relationship and love and connection, and not just one-on-one, but institutionally? How are institutions a reflection of the way in which we love neighbors? And then we've created a community engagement process by which we say at a very grassroots level, how do neighbors and stakeholders of all different shapes and sizes and stripes come together to learn how to be neighbors, and then to begin to shape that neighborhood in the image of neighbors, not in the image of economic viability, per se, or even safety per se, but rather as neighbors that then leads to all of those other things. So instead of it being imposed, what would it look like if it lifted up?
Okay.
So that's the kind of work that we're up to in Atlanta and around the country.
You have touched on a lot of things, so we're going to interject here and then move to the stories from our other two panelists, because what Andy shared and what Jada shared, it's worth pausing to just discuss those things for a moment, right? While they're fresh on our minds, before we move to the other two panelists. Because I think defining poverty is very important, because people have different definitions. And sometimes when we say poverty, people just think about homeless people. Have you encountered that? Mm-hmm. Or I help homeless people, but the unseen people. But then there are a lot of homeless people who are unseen. Sometimes I sit in Atlanta in my car and I watch people walk by homeless people. There's this kind of, I don't want to make eye contact because I have to see that you're a person if I look at you. So when Andy asks how, I think that's a question we really need to address today. How poverty? How did poverty happen? Where does it come from? And as he mentioned, it's a heart issue. This is how Dr. King phrases it. He says, we need heart change and legislative change. Would you agree with that? Mm-hmm. Like, we need to change as people, which is the hard part to mention to people. Right, well, you're changing all these systems. I think we need to do some personal reflection and change ourselves. And then also the systemic change, which we can't neglect. But what he mentioned is, if we don't infuse our culture with nonviolence, with love, with peace, then the institutions will remain the same, systems remain the same. So that work has to be in tandem. So just to pause there for a moment and connect that to the work, because there's a work, but then there's a heart behind the work. And we want to pull all of that together so that it's just not busy work. Like we build homes, but we also want to look at, why do we have to build homes, right? So how do we examine that? So we're going to talk more about that a little later. Those are some of the questions when people start asking, why is there poverty across the world? Then if we really examine the answers, it gets a little difficult and I don't feel so good. Because I'm looking at my $1,000 iPhone 10. And we have to kind of deal with where all of that comes from. What's the root of poverty? How do we address it and deal with it? Liz.
Great, thank you so much. It's really good to be here and to have everyone here. I was thinking about one of my favorite quotes from Reverend Dr. King. You made me think of another one, but I might go to that in a minute. But
Dr. King quotes are always welcome.
They always are, right? Mm-hmm. I just could read them every day. So in December of '67, 50 years ago, he got onto the Canadian broadcast system with the Massey Lectures that then is published in Trumpet of Conscience, and says, the dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution, not against the people, but against the structures through which society is refusing to take means which have been called for and are at hand to lift the load of poverty. There are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. Just kind of take that in. I try to read this quote every day because it starts off that the dispossessed of this nation live in a cruelly unjust society. And we do. We live in a cruelly unjust society. There are 140 million poor or low-income people in the United States. That's 43.5 of the entire US population. 80% of Americans at some point in our lives will experience poverty. 37 million people have no health care. 250,000 people die every year, according to the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University, because of poverty and low wealth. That's more than the number of people who die from heart attacks, strokes, and cancer combined. They're killed by poverty, by something that could be cured. We have the means which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. 250,000 people die every year, and we have the means, but we don't have the will to change that. We've been traveling around this country looking at this kind of new and unsettling force of poor people who have little or nothing to lose, trying to take up where Dr. King and Mrs. King left off in terms of building a poor people's campaign for this time. In the last couple of weeks, I was in Lowndes County, Alabama, where the SNCC house was, where the Black Panther Party has its roots, along that route between Selma and Montgomery. In Lowndes County today, families are living with raw sewage in their back and front yards. The businesses in the community have recently gotten sanitation services piped in for them, but not the families. I was just in Marks, Mississippi, where the mule train to Washington left from. 50 years later, the rural hospital has closed. The grocery stores in the neighborhood have closed. There is deep racism and poverty. Marks is still one of the poorest counties in the entire country. We were just in Detroit, Michigan, where there are 100,000 households who have been cut off of water because they have some of the highest water bills in the country when they're next to one of the largest freshwater bodies in the world. The Nestle Corporation can go in and bottle as much water as they want from the same sources of water for $1 a year and sell that for billions of dollars of profit. But families in Detroit have their water cut off, have their homes taken away because their water bills are so high, and then lose their children because they don't have water. Teachers in Detroit have to go in and say to the kids in their class, do not tell me if you don't have running water. Because if you do, I have to report it. And if I report it, you will be taken out of your home. This is one of the richest countries in the world in one of the richest times in history. We are living in a cruelly unjust society. But poor people are taking action together. I was in West Virginia and Kentucky last week as a part of this organizing tour. West Virginia that just got off of this amazing strike of teachers. Kentucky that is following suit. And there were poor white and poor black Appalachian families in those rooms saying, we have to see our commonalities. We have to come together and try to organize to end poverty in our community. But we don't always hear about it. It's not what always makes it onto the TV. It's not always the stories that we're told. Instead, there's a lot about Stormy Daniels right now, but not about the real heroes and heroines across this nation who are actually figuring out how to have health care when no one has health care, or figuring out how to feed their families, or trying to stop the demolition of their homeless encampment by both white militia groups and the police. And so I think that Dr. King has a lot of lessons for us 50 years later. I think many of those quotes, and I'll do one more and then we can keep on talking, but in many different places in the last year of his life, Dr. King talked about what true compassion was. He said, true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It causes us to question an edifice that produces beggars. And so I think what we see is that we need change, not charity. We need to restructure the edifices that produce beggars, which are actually the edifices that also produce billionaires. And we have to have a whole revolution of values that prioritizes people over profit and human need over things like corporate greed. And I think we're seeing that actually happening and kind of rising up from communities across this country and across this world where people are saying life could be better, life could be different, and we're gonna, take action together.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm really grateful to be here. I'm very moved by the words of all of the panelists. So I started an organization called Love Beyond Walls about 4.5 years ago, and we advocate for those experiencing homelessness and poverty as a way of changing the narrative of the poor. Most times when you hear the word poor, people who have extreme privilege have certain biases or stereotypes about the poor. Whether they're lazy, they think they're lazy. They have no morals. They have character flaws. And these stereotypes create this lens in which poor people are viewed. And so it started to cause me to ask this question: how do we measure worth in American culture? Most times we measure worth with extrinsic things. What social club you belong to, where do you live, what gated community you belong to, where did you get your degree, how much money do you make per year, where do you drink coffee? And we begin to measure worth based upon extrinsic things instead of intrinsic value and worth. And I believe that creates the distance between rich and poor many times, because when this lens is created and we measure people based upon extrinsic things, then we say the people who don't have these things aren't worthy. And so one of the ways in which we fight this false narrative of poverty is to challenge the perceptions that people have of the poor. Because when we see people who are experiencing poverty based upon a lens of intrinsic worth and value, we see people being fashioned and created in the image of God. And if we start with intrinsic worth and value, we begin to adopt this quote that John Perkins says when he says, we can't give anybody dignity, we can only affirm it. We can only see people created and fashioned in the image of God and affirm who they already are. And that takes hard work, because it takes us setting aside some of the things in which we find our identity. The cars we drive, the places we roam, the people we associate with. And so we do this work, and one of the ways in which we do it among the millennial generation is by doing awareness campaigns. We do these demonstrations to educate people about the realities of those living in poverty and experiencing homelessness. One of the campaigns that actually launched this organization is my wife and my kids allowed me to live as a homeless person in the city. Less than a mile and a half away from here, I slept under the bridge, the I-75-85 bridge, for over a month. I literally took nothing. I didn't have a change of clothes. I didn't have a toothbrush. I had literally nothing. I literally took off my shoes of comfort and put on the shoes of those in which we are trying to enter into a healthy and holistic relationship with. I remember living under the bridge in the middle of December and having to use donated clothes that people would bring out under the bridge and use that as firewood to keep warm. I remember standing on the corners with my friends experiencing homelessness, begging for $1. I remember talking and having conversation with my friends about not having enough funds to purchase medication from the pharmacy. I remember being put out of restaurants and being looked down upon over and over and over again. And it made me think and feel the depths of social exclusion when you're caught in the trappings of homelessness or you're experiencing extreme poverty. I'll never forget sleeping behind an abandoned building right here in the heart of the city with trash and feces, with my friends experiencing homelessness, and being so distraught and almost in tears with my friends because right behind us as we slept in rubbish was an abandoned building that had been sitting 10 years. So the solution to the homelessness was right behind us. And it also made me think about the excess that we have in this country that we need to start to do much more with. As Liz stated, we have the resources, the means to create the solutions to eradicate the poverty that exists all across this nation. But it goes back to the question, how do we define worth? Because if we really define worth based upon intrinsic value, then we would see the people who are going through these struggles as worthy, as priority, as people who are deserving of love that we should prioritize to help lift up because they're our brothers and sisters. But when we stay in this place where we define worth based upon extrinsic things, we continue to see commercials during NFL breaks that cost $5 million, and you could have 10 commercials in a row, which would be $50 million that could solve the Flint water crisis. We continue to see abandoned buildings sit all around the city that in most cases are owned by local government that could be repurposed and used to actually empower the people instead of allowing predatory investors to come in, tear down, build up, and displace the people that are already there. We have to redefine how we see worth in this country, and we're on the side of helping people change their perceptions about how they view people who are caught in the trappings of poverty.
Thank you. Thank you. Panels, I believe, have the capacity, if they're powerful, to cause us to leave saying, how can I help with that? So our hope here today is that in hearing these panelists, we don't just leave and say, oh, that was a great panel, but we say, what can we do to eradicate poverty? Because as one of the triple evils, Dr. King talks about how it is an absolute must that in order to build a beloved community, we eradicate poverty. But they mentioned people here today, and we don't want to lose sight of the people. So when we ask what is poverty, what does it look like, we heard about families that don't have mailboxes. And we heard about Angel, right? Angel is kind of seared in our minds, those families without mailboxes. The families in Detroit, Lowndes County, Alabama, families that have raw sewage in their yards. And then, as Terrence continued to talk, if you notice, he continued to use the word, friends. I talk with my friends. His friends, we can see his friends. So as we're having this discussion, I want you to keep the people in mind, because it's all about the people. Sometimes we can do the work, but we might not see the people. And we have to concentrate, to focus on that. Because as Liz mentioned, social media and those types of things will have us focused on something totally different. We're mad about mistresses, but there are millions of people in poverty. So we have a misplaced energy. So let's start with some questions. You mentioned a quote from Dr. King, which is on my list, about transforming structures and systems and edifices. And the phrase that he uses is transforming Jericho Road. If you know the parable, the scripture, there's a man that's fallen on hard times. He's been robbed, and people come along, and two of the people don't pay him any attention. They keep going. Then there's what the parable calls a good Samaritan who stops to help him. And they're on Jericho Road. So Dr. King uses this analogy to say, we don't only need to help the man who's fallen among thieves. We need to transform Jericho Road. So let's talk about that, because Andy mentioned something, and then Jada and Terrence and then Liz about what's happening in our communities. How do we transform Jericho Road? What's the path? That's a first question, isn't it?
Very easy.
Let's start right there. Because I think if we leave today with some notions around what is the work that we can do to actually affect change, that's important. Because we've gotten information, what do we do with it? Because we can get heavy with information. The more they were talking, the more I felt myself sinking in my seat. Like, wow, that's a lot, as the young people say, that's a lot. But we can also talk about what can we do. So how do we transform Jericho Road? Just thinking about systems in this country, hearts in this country, in the world, because Dr. King said we live in a world house. So how do we transform and change the things that you are witnessing?
Well, we do work with many people who are considered the working poor, people who make very little to nothing, working 40, 50 hours per week, and at the end of the month, they still don't have enough resources to barely survive. And so I think one of the ways in which we empower people is by paying them a wage that is livable, right? Because if you're living in the community and housing prices are going up, inflation is taking its course, and you're still making the same thing, then the pathway to homelessness becomes very nigh. And so one of the ways in which I think we need to legislate is demanding that people are paid living wages. Yeah.
I really, what's stuck in my mind is what Liz said about the edifices of poverty. And one of the things about poverty is that you have no safety net, right? You have very low resilience. You're just, in some cases, if you don't have health care, your child having a broken leg, that's your one step away from homelessness. And so even with better wages, which are critical, like what are the things that can give people assets or something to build wealth? I mean, that's what the power structure has locked people out of wealth, be it redlining, yes, be it just lack of, so there's the policy side of it to really affirmatively give access to people, but just also the education. Like one of the things that we see from our homeowner, part of our homeowner process is like teaching people, this is how you change a filter. This is home ownership 101. Like this is how taxes are gonna, this is how you do your budget. Like if there's no family history, if there's no one around you that owns a home or has ever purchased, knows even what a stock is, or and you have no history or no of that, we've got to start thinking like, what are the things that create that resilience, that give people access to equity in something, that then they have a safety net to fall back on because things go wrong. And that's just the difference between a person who's poor, if you're not, things go wrong and you are fine, you bounce back. But if you can't bounce back. So that's why I'm just thinking about how do you bounce back, and that involves breaking down the edifices and thinking of solutions to do that.
That also makes me think about how important community is. I mean, if you were to ask somebody who is caught in the trappings of poverty, who can you call when life happens? Most times people don't have a Warren Buffett for a cousin. Right? And I think a large part of the safety net is through relationships. People being connected with people who have networks and stability in their lives to help people weather the storms. Because without community, crisis can take you out.
I'd definitely say amen to all of that. And, there's this interesting, which I think is central piece of scripture where Paul tells the church in Corinth that God's killing them off, right? He says you're sharing in the meal in such a way that shames those that the world has already shamed, and some of you have died and some of you have fallen ill, and because you treat people in an unworthy way. So we've developed this tradition in the church before we take communion or Eucharist or whatever you call it, to say words of peace to one another. Because if you can't say peace, you better not take the meal because you might die. I wonder if Christians who already have the logic would say, what would it look like if we created those spaces where peace could happen so that I don't have to die? What if in these communities, one of the I think things that we all know is that we live in an incredibly segregated time, even if there's no legalized Jim Crow. It's incredibly segregated. And the problem with that is you know who you know, and who you know are people that are just like you. So if you're rich, you know rich people. If you're poor, you know poor people. So if something happens, you got no one to turn to because they're in the same place that you're in. So what would it look like if we created those sorts of spaces where people began to trespass the boundaries? I mean, how do you create those kinds of spaces where everyone is welcome to that space, and in that space might learn how to be friends with someone that's different from them? How do we create those spaces? And I think some of them are in very intentional sorts of ways, as Jen does. And some of them are in subversive sorts of ways, where people don't know that that's what they're doing, but it happens in a much more organic sorts of way. So I think if we can continue to create spaces, if this isn't the end, I think everything, it's an all the above sort of thing, but I think one of those things has to be that we create spaces where people learn to be neighbors, and then when, if we're doing ministry, then I've already set up that boundary of how far I'm going to go with you. But if we're doing friendship, then what wouldn't I do for you? So how do we create those kinds of spaces where people learn how to be friends with people who are radically different from them? And there's all kinds of different creative ways in which we can do that. But I think that along with these other things, which are absolutely correct, we need to create those kinds of spaces where I can tear down the dividing walls, and I can eat the meal in peace and not in death.
So I think it's really helpful to acknowledge kind of how overwhelming and how much it is.
That's a lot. Yeah, I would say.
It just that we got to go there before we get to a place where we come up with solutions. And I think, if we follow the arcs of Dr. King's sermons, hopefully a lot of us paid a lot of attention on April 3rd to the one that's called I've Been to the Mountaintop, right? But he gets to the mountaintop only after being in a valley for a pretty long time with those sanitation workers, acknowledging actually just how bad things are. Or if we talk about, the I Have a Dream, speech, it's only after he's kind of put out the nightmare. And so I think we both have to put out that nightmare, we have to put out that valley, and then we have to then remind people that in history, others have been in valleys, others have been in nightmares. And how has change happened then? And has change happened then? And I think, when we then have this larger historical context that we can bring to the problems of poverty and racism and militarism and ecological devastation to our world today, then we can actually stand on footing that says something different is possible. Not because I'm saying it is, not because I have some cute words about it, not because I have these total magic bullet, solutions, but because people have done more with less in history. And so now we can do what we can do. And so if we look at history, when those that have been most impacted by problems have banded together with moral leaders, with other concerned people, and built a movement. And a movement isn't just a couple of policies or a couple of programs. It isn't just people coming together in different ways and building community. It has to be all of that, right? But it isn't only that. And only in history, when people have come together across the lines that divide us, with those who have little or nothing to lose, in the current status quo, in the lead, that's when changes happen. That's when we get the abolitionist movement. That's when we get women's suffrage. That's when we get labor rights. That's when we get the ending of Jim Crow. That's when we get Native American sovereignty and rights. And we have to acknowledge that those social movements have come and made real gains, real changes, right? We have a lot of real change to do today. And so I think that what does a movement in our day look like now? And where are we in the building of that movement? And so I think that then we have to think about some of the policies that it would look like. And I think it's living wages, it's health care, it's assets and equity, it's surely housing, it's social services, it's sanitation services, it's voting rights, right? I mean, one of the things that we've done in this Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival is we actually started with the 23 states that have enacted voter suppression laws in the past 8 years, since 2010, and found that those states have used voter suppression, especially racist gerrymandering, to then enact and kind of elect politicians who suppress wages, deny health care. So the same states that have voter suppression are the states with the highest child poverty, the highest women in poverty, the least environmental protections, the least protections of LGBTQIA folk, the least immigrant rights, right? So we have to actually see the intersectionality between these things. But we need policies that then show that intersectionality. But to be able to have the power to enact those policies, what we have to do right now, I think, is one, shift the narrative. I've been doing anti-poverty organizing, especially amongst the homeless, for 25 years. And nobody in our kind of larger national conversation today are talking about the issues of poverty and homelessness. You know, we had 25, was it, presidential debates in the 2016 election, in the primaries and in the general election. So amongst the Democrats, amongst the Republicans, independents, everybody, right? Not one of those debates had an hour or a half an hour or even 20 minutes on poverty, on living wages, on universal single-payer health care, on voter suppression. The fact that we have fewer voting rights today than we did 50 years ago, and not one of our politicians talked about it in a national debate. We have to shift the narrative. We have to make our society talk about the issues that impact us the majority of the time. Until we're talking about those issues, until we're insisting that these are the healthcare is an issue, housing is an issue, living wages is an issue. Until that happens, we aren't going to be able to enact policies that address any of those things. But then to do that, we have to build power too. So we have to organize the kinds of communities that people here are talking about, you know, from the ground up, not from the top down. And I think that's how we kind of get ourselves out of this mess, because we are in a mess.
Sure, that reminds me, when you mentioned intersectionality, Dr. King was once talking to a group of white people who were poor and didn't quite understand civil rights and the struggle for racial justice. And Dr. King, once hearing how poor they were and what they were dealing with, said to them, "You all need to be marching with us." Because the notion is sometimes there are no poor white people. But he, in talking to this group of poor white people, reminded them the same issues that we're facing as poor black people, you're facing them too, with the added tension of an issue of racial injustice. But poverty, at this point, does it have a race? You know, does it have an ethnicity? When we think of what does poverty look like, how does discrimination, Dr. King in his book, Why We Can't Wait, mentions discrimination in the eradication of poverty. So is there at times biases in even how we address poverty?
I mean, so perhaps folks know, but the majority of poor people in the United States today are white, right? But if we look proportionately, ratio-wise, the majority of African American and Native American folks are poor, if you look at raw numbers, right? And I think you have to look at both of those together, right? So you have to recognize that the largest number of people in raw numbers are white, and that if we do not unite poor white people and poor people of color, it's going to be pretty hard to end poverty. But we have to also notice that if you look at the 60% of African Americans are poor or low income. 60%, right? I mean, and the same numbers for Native Americans, slightly even higher for Latinos. If you're using the supplemental poverty measure, which is basically 2 times the poverty line, because the poverty line is so inaccurate and so outdated. So I think you have to look at race. And by looking at race, it also includes white people. I'm white.
What?
My mom is Armenian, and the Armenians, I don't know if folks know this, basically went to the Supreme Court to be considered white because there were such real benefits, right? And there were other folks that brought their cases to the Supreme Court and were not found to be white, but Armenians were. So both I look white and the courts have determined that I'm white too. So that's insane, right? It's like totally insane to think about that. But it also shows that if we don't talk about race, and we don't talk about the intersection of race and poverty, we are, in this country, we are never gonna end racism or poverty. And we need to and can actually end both.
Let me also mention too, the King Center, its premier initiative, its major work, is to educate and train people on Dr. King's philosophy and his methodology of nonviolence, which includes 6 principles of nonviolence and 6 steps of nonviolence. So we happen to have today, I believe, 3 people who are representing the Christian faith by way of their work. But one of the things I wanted to be sure we conveyed as the center is Dr. King's 6th principle of nonviolence is the universe is on the side of justice. And it goes on to explain that regardless of faith, if you practice a religion or you have a faith culture, if we believe the universe is on the side of justice, we can commit ourselves to the work of nonviolence. And you know the quote, the arc of the moral universe is long, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That's derived from that principle. So we wanted to let you know everybody can be a part of social change. And it's very important that we see that, and we also understand how to utilize nonviolence to do the work. And by the way, Dr. King embraced nonviolence not just as a social change tactic, but as his way of life. So just to mention that to you, but also as a segue to something that's included in Liz's bio, Always With Us, which I believe is derived from a scripture that people use all the time. Like, I can be talking to people about eradicating poverty, and they'll say, Jesus said, the poor we'll always have with us. So people use Jesus to excuse poverty. Go figure. The man who said, take care of the least of these and love your neighbor as yourself. So not only is that used that way, but there seems to be a common notion among people of different faiths and among people who may not practice a faith that poverty is not something we can eradicate or should work to eradicate, because the poor will always have with us, always with us. Let's just take a moment and talk about how that notion causes us to not seek to eradicate poverty.
Well, certainly the scripture is actually, because you don't do the things of God, you don't do His will, you don't love your neighbors, you'll have poor people with you all the time, right? So that's the actual
people be taking the Bible and just flinging it left and right.
Because you don't do what I say, there's going to be poor folks. Not what I say, what Jesus says. I think that the story of humanity, regardless of what faith you are or no faith, is a matter of taking whatever you want to believe and making it so that it can justify your benefit. So whether that's the Christian faith or any other faith or no faith, your worldview, and you convince yourself that it's true, that's the really sad, the sad part, right, is that not only are you using it to manipulate others, but you've manipulated yourself as well, which is certainly why life must be lived in meaningful community. Because somebody has to be able to say to me, Andy, you are crazy, and I have to be able to take them seriously. Right, so the more we isolate ourselves and think that we can just make up our own ways, especially if you're a person of faith, is for sure a recipe for self-justification. And that's what we, I mean, the colonialism and the slave trade was self-justification, right? So you had to, I'm a Christian and I can't think of treating people in these poor sorts of ways, so I have to somehow create a new way of thinking within my system so that I can justify taking your stuff and your body, right? So you had to justify because you can't live with yourself otherwise. So you're just constantly having to do that, or don't do it. And why would you not want to do it? It's easier to justify doing it. So that's certainly, I think, part of our story of using Scripture in certain ways and worldviews to just justify our own selfish ends. And the more we live outside of a community, and a diverse community that can see a poor person needs to tell a rich person, have you lost your mind? That's not how it works. So the more that breaks down, the more easy it becomes to justify my own selfishness and ends.
In my bio, it mentions that I have a degree from Harvard Business School, which means I have a degree in capitalism. And when I, it's it's really tragic because there is, and it's just getting worse today, but there is, part of what capitalism does is it provides incentives to hoard, right? And it's better when you can have a Bible verse to justify that. But there was actually a book that came out a few months ago about hoarding and about the middle class increasingly hoarding opportunities for advancement, so like legacy preferences and university admissions. I learned that doesn't exist in Britain, which blew my mind. But it's a very a critical function of what happens here. So you hoard opportunities for people to live in your neighborhood by creating exclusionary zoning and doing NIMBYism. You hoard access to good schools by making it based on local property taxes, and so no one else can get in. And so we are increasingly, and the middle class is feeling increasingly frenzied to aspire and to increasingly hoard and to keep people out of opportunities and keep people locked into poverty. And so the part of that gets back to people and human interactions is how do we create a narrative that it is mutually beneficial not to hoard, to make sure that opportunities are universally accessible for people. Like, how do we create that narrative and that urgency to do that? And our system, it's a really difficult thing, and I don't have an answer, but our system really works against that, and then we've got to fight that instinct to hoard.
It's interesting because as I hear you talk about hoarding, like all of us are impoverished in some way. Many of us are impoverished immaterially, and many people are impoverished materially. And I think people who justify hoarding or keeping things at bay from those who are materially poor haven't really fully understood their own poverty. And I think understanding your own immaterial poverty helps you to connect to the pains and the plights of people who are impoverished materially. Because then we start to understand that we all are in need of each other. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I wasn't sure I should jump in because I've written a whole book on this passage. And
You just jumped out at me. I said, always with us.
So I have
Yeah.
like way too much to say, of course, because for 20 years, there isn't a week of my life that goes by where somebody actually doesn't use that passage.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Like, it's not that it's like, it just comes everywhere. It comes from atheists. It comes from folks from various religious traditions. If folks know anything, they know that Jesus said that poverty will always be with us, right? I mean, and then it comes from very devout people and folks from, whatever. And I actually liken it to other moments again in history when the Bible has been used to justify injustice, right? I mean, so whether it's the slaves obey your masters and like the kind of Bible that slaveholders produced that didn't include the Exodus, that didn't include the prophets, that didn't include any of Jesus's, releasing captives. I mean, because there were lots of those Bibles that were, you can go see them at Fisk University, at other places, right? Or whether it's how women and queer folk have been, beaten basically with the Bible. But I think actually we have a lot of work to do, especially, and by we I mean people of faith who hold these texts and traditions important and sacred, to show what actually is really going on in those passages. Because, I mean, the entire Bible, from the beginning to, from Genesis to Revelation, basically is about one anti-poverty program after another. I mean, that is what it is. I mean, you have the Deuteronomic covenants, you have the prophets who are talking about, you have manna, which is about, not letting people hoard, that it rots or disappears if you try to take too much, and if you take too little, you still have enough. I I mean, and then you have, you know, when you get into the you know, the New Testament texts, you have all the Gospels that, I mean, you know, are everything about bringing good news to the poor. I mean, you know, Jesus's first, you know, sermon is that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, is anointing me to bring good news to the Patokos, those who have been made poor by systemic injustice, right? I mean, that's what that Greek term is. Or Paul, I mean, one of the only things that's in a bunch of his letters is this kind of survival program called The Collection, which is about poor people pooling their resources and making sure that the movement sustains. That's not what we hear in our churches on Stewardship Sunday. You know, we hear that it's about giving money to the church, but what it is actually is about funding a movement of poor people to keep on keeping on. Or, you know, in Revelation, there's this condemnation about the slave trade and poverty, and like how bodies and souls can be sold, you know. So again, if you just look at the entire, I mean, and then somehow we pull out this one passage that really is about, you know, that it's our fault if there's poverty because we're not following God's commandments, and is actually a critique also of charity, right? It's also, because it happens in this context. In John's gospel, it's actually Judas, who is the keeper of the money box, who makes the critique, right? Somebody who's kind of like a poverty pimp, making money off of the poor, who is saying, well, couldn't we have sold this really nice thing and given the proceeds to the poor? But doesn't that actually follow what we're told to do? You know, what we think are the only solutions to poverty anyways, which is that you make a lot of money, or you invest your money, and then you give some of the proceeds, some of the leftovers to the poor, right? But instead, what Jesus represents is like the bringing in of a movement of poor people led by a poor person who's also divine, you know, himself, who's homeless. He's homeless, he's a refugee, right? I mean, you know, he's, so to me, it actually, I mean, I think there's just so much here about both history and about, you know, in our text, about our call to take up the fight to end poverty.
Yes. Look for on the shelves next year and edit a version of the Bible called Anti-Poverty Programs. I'm just telling Liz. I think that would be a...
There is a poverty and justice Bible, if folk have seen it.
No, but you can write one based on what you're saying.
There is, but there is one if people haven't seen it, and it highlights the 2,500 passages in the Bible in red that are about poverty and justice. And folks actually, you know, said that if you cut those out, the Bible literally falls apart. But then somehow, you know, the only passages we hear from the Bible are, if you don't work, you shall not eat, you know, the poor will be with you always, you know, these kinds of things. And so.
Sure. Wednesday, on the actual 50th anniversary of Dr. King being assassinated, the King Center awarded MLK Peace Prize to two individuals, one of them being Brian Stevenson. That's what his name does. Yeah. And Mr. Stevenson, in accepting his MLK Peace Prize, said this. He said, "Many people believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth, but this country talks too much about money. I believe that the opposite of poverty is justice." And I just want to talk about that for a few minutes as we discuss poverty and some thoughts around how we can eradicate it, but also the programs that we can have. This is the thing. There are many ways to be engaged in social change. And Dr. King talks about programs of social uplift. He talks about systemic change, transforming Jericho Road. Each one of us just has to find our spot and work together and build coalitions to make that happen. There's home building. There's helping young ladies who reveal to you that they're prostitutes, they're in poverty. There's the work of the Poor People's Campaign. And there's this work of putting yourself literally in the shoes of someone who's homeless, becoming homeless, and then building campaigns that make people aware. So the question is, what does the opposite of poverty look like? And then we'll end by talking about, where do I fit in? After we've heard all of this, hopefully there's something in us that's saying, hey, there's a way I can help, and there's something I can do. So, but first we want to ask, what does the opposite of poverty look like? Mr. Stevenson said the opposite of poverty is justice. But justice is an often used word. Do you all find yourselves, you look at these words and you say, what does that even mean? Like intersectionality and these different words like this that people fling out and throw at you, and you're just like, I don't even know what that is. Can I love you and you love me? And I take part in your suffering and take part in your joy and you take part in mine. But these are actually important words and phrases, because when we talk about social justice, we have to understand, what does justice look like? So if the opposite of poverty is justice, what does it look like to eradicate poverty? At the end, what's the end result if there's no poverty, first in this country and then in the world?
Well, to go back to a King quote, the end is reconciliation. The end is beloved community, right? This is what he says, and for sure what we talk about. So I would say that the opposite of poverty is community, and not simply in that you and I have community, although that as well. I mean, I don't know how many people who I would say grew up poor. Some didn't grow up rich, but I didn't grow up poor. But a lot of friends who did, who said, I didn't know that I was poor until I was older, and I was around people who had other means, right? So certainly there's this level that counteracts poverty, but community at a much grander level, right? That we are all part of the human tapestry, right? And that community, that level that you are my brother, that you are my sister, even if I don't know you. And I have a responsibility for you, and you have a responsibility for me. That is the opposite of poverty. When Jesus talks about poverty, it's not a definition so much that he gives as it is narratives of human beings, right? People who are left out of community, widows, strangers, orphans, right? People who are pushed to the margins of community, of beloved community, right? So for me, the opposite of poverty is community. You're in the flourishing, the beloved community. That's the opposite of poverty. Poverty is a relational term that results in less money in your pocket. Poverty can't be about the money in your pocket. Poverty has to be about the way in which you've been isolated and marginalized within the community.
Thank you. So when you were saying this quote from Brian Stevenson, it made me think, maybe because my mind was in the Bible a minute ago, but the quote that the poor will be with you always comes from is a quote of Deuteronomy 15. And Deuteronomy 15, some theologians say it's like the most radical passages in the Bible, but people just don't know anything about them. And it basically says that like if you're supposed to follow these commandments, and those commandments are to forgive debts, to release slaves, to pay people what they deserve, and to loan out money even if you know you're never going to get anything back. And then it says that, and if you do those things, for one, you'll have no poor people among you. You'll have no one needy among you. And it says that you will be a prosperous nation. And to me, it always strikes me as that doesn't sound at all like what would make for prosperity, right? Like in our logic, in our capitalist logic, it doesn't sound like if you forgive debts, release, slaves, whether it's people in slavery or whether it's, the kind of indebtedness, you pay people, all the money that they need to not just survive, but thrive. And you lend out money knowing you'll never get it back. Not that you'll get it back in 7 years, not that you'll get it back in 10 years, not that you'll get it back over 20 years, you'll never get it back. That leads to prosperity for the entire nation. Like, that is a crazy logic. Like, that goes against everything I've ever learned in any economics class I've taken. And it is the biblical logic. It is the kind of prophetic logic that exists. And so I think it's a really great idea to flip that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. It's justice, it's righteousness, and it's justice not, I agree, like not just this word that doesn't kind of means everything and nothing, but is, it has a very, again, justice and righteousness in biblical terms have very specific, and it's about everybody's needs being met, society being organized around the needs of the most marginalized, which means being organized around everybody, right? Because if you've figured out a way for the most marginalized, whether that's widows, whether that's poor people, whether that's disabled folks, whether that's queer folks, like if you've made it so that everybody's included and nobody's excluded, and that everybody's needs matter and nobody's needs don't matter, then you have not just eradicated, material or spiritual poverty. You actually produced a life in a world where, we celebrate diversity, but that also people get to thrive. Like, people get to, give what they have to give and bring those gifts to something bigger than themselves, and also you don't have to worry about the things that, again, the majority of people, in this world worry about every day, because their lives are being cut short by material and immaterial poverty.
We have to start to wrap up. Andy mentioned a beloved community, and that's a phrase that's often used in conversation about Dr. King. But when we talk about it, we find out that often it's not understood what he was saying. But we want to be sure today that we kind of say, how do you define that? What does that look like? It wasn't a utopia. Dr. King actually believed we could build a beloved community where there was no poverty, where we could work to eradicate war, and that we could eradicate racism. Some people may say he was delusional, he was overly optimistic, but hope kind of fuels this work. If you lose hope that humanity can change, it's kind of like, why even go do this? So the beloved community is not a utopia. It's the actual aftermath of a world embracing nonviolence. So when we think about that, then we're also thinking, what does the world look like without those triple evils, without war, without poverty? And as long as we can keep that before us, without racism, then we can kind of fuel ourselves to do the work, that it can actually happen, even if it's the beloved community in pockets, So it sounds like in your communities, in your sphere of influence, each one of you has created, or you're working to create, the beloved community, which each of us can do. So we just want to take a moment, for some introspection and to think, how can I help create this in my pocket, in my part of the world? And what would it look like if wherever I am every day, I say, I'm going to work to create the beloved community and address these triple evils and embrace nonviolence. And if you don't know what nonviolence is or fully understand it, there's a 2-day intensive on nonviolence here at the King Center on April 20th and 21st. Intensive, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. each day to start to dive into what is nonviolence according to Dr. King. So just closing, because I saw a sign that said 1 minute, and I think it's a Baptist minute at this point, church minute. Just give me one word that kind of fuels you in the work, that would describe what helps you continue to focus on poverty as one of the triple evils that we have to eradicate in the world.
Love.
Connection.
Fusion.
Dignity.
Think about your one word. If there's anything that you're thinking about right now that you want to say, that's going to fuel me, that if I'm not already involved, I want to jump in this work. Because again, we don't want to leave today and just say that was a great panel. We want to leave galvanized to do something. Because the question America and the world is facing right now is, do we really want to end poverty? That's, when we talk about what we talked about today, the answer, I believe, at this point is a resounding no as a nation. And what does that mean for us as a country and as a world if somehow we're okay with millions of people being hungry and in poverty? And if we're not okay with it, then we have a charge to do something. And what can each of us do to help someone who's in poverty and to help eradicate poverty? That's the question. Isn't that a great question to leave with today? You all are looking at me like I don't feel light, moderator. I feel kind of heavy. It's okay. It's okay. Thank you to our panelists. Please give them a hand. And thank you so much for joining us for this panel.
Thank you for watching this beloved Community Talks. Together we win facing poverty, racism, and militarism. This project helps us define the forms of violence that exist in a vicious cycle, or better known as the triple evils. Poverty, racism, and militarism are interrelated and stand as barriers to our living in the beloved community. When we work to remedy one evil, we affect all evils. Nonviolence is the best way to combat the triple evils. Join us in our efforts to educate and train the global community in nonviolence. Please share this message and continue to support the efforts of the beloved Community Talks across the nation. Thank you for your support.